Good evening and welcome once again to Dukakis Center Online. I'm your host, David Wisner from the American College of Thessaloniki, ACT. Joining me on the program this evening is Peter Gries, professor of Chinese politics at University of Manchester and the director of the Manchester China Institute. With whom, it should be said, we have collaborated in the past. We co-hosted a lovely webinar with the notable American China expert Orville Schell back in the spring. And that is, one should hope, the first of many such collaborations with the Manchester China Institute. I'd add also that Peter is a sometime resident of Thessaloniki. And part of the purpose of our hosting this program today is to introduce him to a broader Anglophone public throughout Greece. This is a pan-Hellenic broadcast. Peter, you have been educated. You received your doctorate at the University of California in Berkeley. You've taught in various places in the United States, notably the University of Oklahoma, the flagship campus in Norman. A few years ago, you moved to Manchester and took up a position as professor of Chinese politics at the University of Manchester, and simultaneously the director of the Manchester China Institute. Your exposure to things Chinese is a result in part of your upbringing. Your father was an American Foreign Service officer. You were born in Singapore, so the story goes, and you spent a few years in the impressionable time of your youth in Beijing, where you first learned Chinese. We've collaborated in the past, I should say once again, but for those of the public who are not aware of your work, why don't you tell us a little bit about your background and how it transpires that you have ended up in Manchester these days?
Sure. Thank you, David, and thank you for hosting this event and for this opportunity to, in a way, introduce myself to the local Greek Anglophone English-speaking community. I'm very excited about my future research on Greek relations with China, and in particular Greek views of China and the drivers of those views. And I'll be having my sabbatical the first half of next year in Thessaloniki working on that. So I imagine I will have the opportunity to meet a number of the people who are listening in today. In terms of how I ended up at Manchester, that's academic careers are odd because there's an overabundance of PhDs and a scarcity of good jobs. So often you end up where the best opportunities are. In academia, it's not like being a lawyer or a doctor but depending on the field, you can sometimes choose where you want to live. In my case, I actually have been very lucky because of growing up in China and the language acquisition that I had when I was a child. So I actually speak Chinese with a bit of a Beijing accent, and that has helped me quite a bit in my career. And then in terms of people who combine the social science analytic skills, the politics PhD, and the Chinese language skills of my generation, it's a fairly small group of people. So I was hired away from the University of Colorado, where I had my first tenure track position, to go to Oklahoma because they were looking for someone to help them create a China Institute there. And that's a long story. You might ask why Oklahoma of all places.
Why Oklahoma?
Yeah.
Middle of the United States.
Well, long story short, it's David Boren, who was a former governor and senator representing the state of Oklahoma, was at that time the president of the University of Oklahoma, took a special interest in what he just called national security languages. So he was very passionate about educating the American public about countries like China, Russia, Arabic, Middle Eastern countries. Anyway, I had a great opportunity when I was still quite early in my career to go there, create an institute. After about a decade, I felt like I had done what I had promised them I would do. I had put Oklahoma sort of on the map and for China studies, I think.
No small doing, I would say.
What's that?
No small doing, I would say.
Yeah, it was a big job, big challenge, especially initially. But then, at the end of a decade, I think I felt like I had done much of what I could in Oklahoma. It had also been a great opportunity for me to expand my skill set. One nice thing about Oklahoma is it's not a big city like New York or Washington or San Francisco where you get a lot of visitors. And so I was able to actually use my relative solitude to retrain myself as a social psychologist. So now I'm a political psychologist. But anyway, having that experience at Oklahoma meant that when a colleague of mine, who at that time was teaching at a university in Glasgow, forwarded to me a job advert for the University of Manchester, which was looking for a senior China politics scholar who they also hoped would help fundraise for and create a China Institute. I almost felt like the ad had been written just for me. And I actually wasn't actively on the job market then, but I knew that within a few years I would want to be potentially leaving Oklahoma. And when I heard about this job that was such a good fit, I applied for it. And I think one of the main reasons I got it was because I had already done in Oklahoma what they needed someone to do in Manchester, which is to create a new institute. And that's what I spent, especially my first 2 years at Manchester doing, was finalizing the fundraising and then actually setting up the Manchester China Institute.
Yeah, and it should be said, really, it's quite a distinct skill set to administer a center and to fundraise and speak to the public. You're not cloistered in your office doing your research, standing in front of students who don't necessarily know better. This is really it's a different livelihood.
It is running an institute. In a way, it's sort of the best kind of job for an academic, in my opinion, if you don't love the bureaucracy so much, but you still you want to be more than just an academic. The next level is to become a dean.
Yeah.
To become a dean at a large school, and I've been headhunted for those kinds of jobs, and it's very flattering. Dean of the School of International Studies at Australian National University or some of these terrific places. But I just don't. I think that would take me too far away from my core competence in China. And in a way, it would be a waste of the skills that I've developed. Running an institute, I can help my junior colleagues. That's one of the things I take the most joy in, is supporting, well, first of all, supervising PhD students, but also hosting postdoctoral students, helping them transition into tenure track jobs.
Right.
But running a China Institute, I also get to, support the development of China studies across the campus, as well as continue to pursue my own research.
So why don't we segue? Let's segue into that, the research, and eventually what brings you to Greece, and the kind of footprint you hope to leave behind you in the next couple of years, with regards to your areas of expertise and what's interesting you currently.
Sure. So my PhD at Berkeley was on Chinese nationalism, and it was basically utilizing my Chinese language and area studies skills that I had picked up as an undergrad and a master's student at Michigan. But then, as I mentioned earlier, when I went to Oklahoma, I had an opportunity to retrain myself in theories and methods from social psychology, which are surveys and experiments. And what I really am now is a political psychologist of international affairs, with a focus on China, and in particular, China's relations with the US and Europe, and to a lesser extent with Korea, Japan, so its neighbors. So and currently my focus, in part because doing good research and gathering research materials in China is quite difficult now. I've been focusing on essentially trying to work with colleagues and gather my own surveys from other countries and understand basically how the world looks at China. And since I've been moved to Manchester, I have focused more on Europe. So a big research project is understanding not just what Europeans think about China and how they feel about China, but trying to dig deeper to look at the underlying drivers or causes of these attitudes. And I'm particularly interested in the role of ideology, identity, history in shaping China attitudes.
And now there's a divergence, it would seem, across Europe of opinion towards China, particularly as China is more aggressive in investing in local economic projects. And you see, for example, Greece, the opinion in Greece tends to be ambivalent at best and generally quite positive, not as negative and critical as one might have expected. But you're involved with colleagues in the Czech Republic, and then it's really pretty much the opposite, isn't it?
That's right. So my earliest research on European views of China was based on a 3-country survey I did when I was back in Oklahoma, collaborating with colleagues in France. And we did a 3-nation study of the big 3 Western European countries. So it was UK, Germany, France. But then more recently, I have collaborated with colleagues in the Czech Republic on surveys that focused more on Central and Eastern Europe. And I'm just about to co-author a piece that's been accepted for publication, looking at the drivers of Central and Eastern European views of China. And as it turns out, the Czech public is one of the most negative. It's quite interesting, but China has become sort of a symbol in a lot of essentially symbolic or expressive politics in the Czech Republic, where the more authoritarian ruling party has tended to depict itself as a supporter of China, perhaps to signal displeasure with Brussels and more progressive politics, while opponents, the progressive Czech public, have been very negative. And so issues like Tibet and Taiwan are kind of day-to-day issues in Prague, believe it or not. It's a very unusual situation. But there are other countries in Central and Eastern Europe that are much more positive, like Serbia. But as you mentioned, my next project, and again, my sabbatical next year, will be looking at South and Southeastern Europe. So I'm interested in being involved in a couple of surveys on how Greeks and Turks view China. And one of the things that's fascinating, as you alluded to, is that actually Greeks on average appear to have some of the most positive attitudes towards China of all European publics. And that will be one of the questions that I will be interested in exploring. But the primary thing I'll be exploring is trying to understand what the core drivers are. Are they things like Greek identities? Are they Greek ideologies? Is it a difference between the left and the right in Greece? Is it Greeks who identify more with the history of democracy in the West, or is it the Greek connections to the East, the symbol of Constantinople? So I've been very interested to learn about how Greece very much is between East and West, or perhaps better, both East and West. And I'm quite interested in the psychology of that and whether that will be tied in with China attitudes.
Now, you're having to learn, as you've indicated, what recent Greek political history is all about, coming really from another place, so to speak. What are some of the things that strike you? In other words, if you're considering the drivers, what pushes the attitude, but we're also looking at variations of opinion. We're looking at what we as political scientists call cleavages, and how we understand it in terms perhaps of a recent political history here in Greece. What strikes you in your early reading of that history?
My comments will have to be very, very speculative, because I still consider myself a complete amateur when it comes to understanding Greek politics, which in a way is fun. This is what's great about being an academic, is that you can just constantly be a student again. Yeah. And I'm very excited about my sabbatical. I get to study Greek, and I get to learn about Greek history and politics. One thing I have noticed in the time that I have spent in Greece is just how far apart the left and right are. Right. And this has to do, I think, with obviously with Greek history, especially post-war Greek history. But the communism is very different, and it's experienced and understood very differently in a place like Greece and a place like the United States. I mean, in the United States, communism is just off the table. Even people on the left, Bernie Sanders says I'm a socialist, and he's easily just tarnished by the right as un-American, basically. So even to say something from a European perspective as mild as that is not possible in the U.S., where in places like Greece and other parts of Europe as well, where there have been very viable communist parties, I think there's more of a subset or a segment of the population on the left that, because of their affinity towards communism, they may sometimes sort of give China the benefit of the doubt on certain issues, just because they see China as fellow travelers. So in the UK, for example, back during the Cold War, there was a segment of the left that was often referred to as the tankies. I only learned about this a few months ago, but these were the people on the left who basically excused, Soviet tanks plowing into Prague. And even though they were very progressive people on the left, because they sympathized with the global communist cause, they sort of overlooked the excesses of Soviet authoritarianism. I imagine there's some of that in Greece as well, among both communist supporters and other far left supporters who are more comfortable with communism. Certainly, they won't stigmatize China for being communist. Although actually, I would argue that China is not meaningfully communist in any way. It's really only communist. The Chinese Communist Party is a nationalist party. In many ways, it's a capitalist party. And certainly the Chinese economy is better described as a capitalist economy than it's not communist. That's for sure.
It brings to mind an article I posted on Facebook a couple of weeks ago, perhaps 2 weeks ago. I mean, how much communism is left in the Chinese Communist Party? It seems to be an anomalous circumstance. So in other words, you're looking at countries throughout Europe. Eastern Europe is a particularly interesting case, it should appear to me. And you're finding that attitudes there are quite the contrary to what we have in Greece. I'm wondering if, because there's a lot of discussion in foreign policy circles in the United States that we're preparing for another Cold War with the People's Republic of China as the foe in this instance. Do we somehow have a dualism? If China's the bad guy, the United States is somehow now poised to be the good guy once again. Do you have that kind of simplistic dualism in some of the places that are being studied or where you're conducting this research?
Yes, so that's a great question. I learned a lot when I was working on that last paper that I have forthcoming now on Central and Eastern European views of China. And I think that kind of almost binary mode of thinking is particularly pronounced among Eastern European countries that are very proximate to Russia.
Right.
So when you look at Poland, when you look at the Baltic states, they have basically spent, well over the last century dealing with, the Soviet menace, right there, the bear of Russia. You go back beyond a century.
Right.
And as a result, their way of viewing China is almost completely mediated through their view of Russia. And because many Baltic states and Poland are very concerned about their security and about Russian military power right on their doorstep, many of them do kind of have this binary view: Russia, China bad, and U.S. good. It's quite different, I think, for other Central European countries that are a little bit farther. So Russia still plays a role because these were all the CEE countries were, former communist countries. So they had that experience behind the Iron Curtain during the Cold War.
It's fading, but it was there.
It was there. And what we found interesting in this last article that I've been mentioning is that the ways that publics in places like the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, the ways that they remembered the Cold War were powerful predictors of how they felt about Russia and China. So, publics, for example, in Prague, who tended to be very skeptical of the communist past, would also be very skeptical of Russia and China. Whereas if you go into the countryside or you go over to Slovakia, where the memories of the Cold War are not so negative, you may have a greater affinity for Russia and less negativity towards China. I think, the Greek case is quite different. I mean, Greece was not behind the Iron Curtain. You had active communist parties, but you also had essentially fascist dictatorships. So the experience of the Cold War was extremely different. I think that my understanding is the ways that Greeks think about outside powers, about great powers, is, these countries that invade Greece, and they're seen as countries like Germany, America, not necessarily directly invade, but meddle. So these are the kind of meddling countries that interfere in small and virtuous Greece. China does not yet fit that mold, I think, in the Greek imagination. This is a hypothesis I'm interested in exploring with the work I'll be doing next year. It seems to me, for example, when we look at coverage of the Piraeus acquisitions that China has made, you can only imagine if it was the US or Germany instead, given the ways that Greeks think about the roles of the US and Germany as outside great powers, interfering within Greek politics. You don't have that response to China yet. And, maybe there's a little bit of a feeling among Greeks that, maybe it's not such a bad thing that, China is there to be another trade partner, maybe even to counter the influence of these other great powers that traditionally, have been seen as interfering in Greek politics. That said, another, what's been interesting for me over these last couple of years with COVID-19 is that there were other small powers that for many years were in Greece's same shoes. So, for example, Canada, Australia, Sweden, for many years tended to have fairly positive views of China, no direct geopolitical conflicts. But then during COVID-19, for a variety of different reasons, China chose to essentially the Chinese leadership chose to bully those countries. And all of a sudden, popular opinion completely shifted. And in a way, when I look at Greece, I see it as possibly a kind of honeymoon or romantic kind of view of there hasn't been any significant conflict or clash with China yet.
Okay.
But if there is, things could change. They did very dramatically in Canada with the hostage diplomacy of the 2 Canadian citizens that lasted several years and just was recently resolved with the release of the 2 Canadian Michaels from Chinese prisons. Australia, which
Right.
because of COVID-19 ended up speaking up, trying to get more information about the origins of the virus, and the Chinese were very tough, including stopping imports of a variety of products, exports from Australia that were important to the Australian economy. Sweden, some tensions surrounding Nobel Prize and other issues that even included the ambassador essentially wanting to infringe on core Swedish values of freedom of expression.
Okay.
And you just saw these publics of these small countries have rapidly changing views of China. So I don't know if that will happen in the Greek case.
Let's shift the focus a little bit, but you have an expertise in Chinese politics. That's what you teach in Manchester. So, we have a habit now, and I see it in all the financial and economic news that I read, that the view from Europe is about a Chinese investment throughout Europe. What is happening from the Chinese perspective? I mean, one suspects there must be a political angle there that is part of a larger diplomatic effort. I mean, are we looking at an attempt really to influence the outcome of decision making in Brussels or in the various member states of the European Union? Is it aggressive? Is it malevolent somehow? I mean, what should we be looking at there, and what sorts of articles maybe in the press are going to give us a better picture precisely of the Chinese perspective on investment in the ports throughout Greece, in projects in Belgrade, in various, the whole program of investment in Europe right now. What sorts of motivations are we able to detect there?
From the Chinese side? I think it's a complicated, long story. Let me sort of pick and choose a few threads to focus on. I think,
for example, we have a habit of speaking of these wolf warriors, that there's an aggressive undertone, that it's really about elevating China's status as a world power, as the dominant power in international politics. I mean, is that what you're reading when you're looking at it as a scholar interested in Chinese politics?
Yeah, that has been the dramatic new development. I mean, basically since COVID-19, when COVID-19 happened and foreign countries, especially Western countries, and most explicitly Australia, started asking questions. From a Chinese perspective, they were pointing fingers, and a decision was made at the very top, probably by Xi Jinping himself, that rather than be humble and be forthcoming and open, they were going to clamp down on information about origins, and they were just going to hit back. And that's where this idea of wolf warrior diplomats came from. And you had China's ambassadors essentially being told that they needed to stand up for China's honor. Now, this needs to also be understood within the context of the growth of nationalism in China and the increasing reliance that the Chinese Communist Party and its leader, President Xi Jinping, place on nationalism as part of their legitimation strategy. So essentially, Xi Jinping has promised a China dream, 中国梦, which is of being restored to its rightful place at the center of international affairs, something that is depicted as wrongfully taken away from China over the past 150 years. We could talk about that history and how Chinese understand that history.
Right.
But it is a grievance narrative that blames the West for China's backwardness. And essentially, it's created expectations among the Chinese public that China be tough, And I think in a way that puts pressure on the Chinese leadership to deliver on its nationalistic promises. And the decision that was made in the last couple of years was really to be visibly tough, to play to audiences at home. But that has cost China in terms of its international image, particularly in Europe, because prior to COVID-19, China, I think, really was looking to Europe as an alternative to the United States, both politically and economically, and then as Western European countries like France and the UK started talking more about human rights. That was the beginning of the 16+1 initiative to essentially draw closer to Central and Eastern European countries who were drawn to the idea of closer relationship with China, in part because they sought to diversify sources of investment and trade away from Brussels. You know, Brussels, with the global financial crisis in 2008, came as a big disappointment to many of these post-communist countries. You know, all of them, after the Cold War, had essentially followed Brussels's rules, and to differing degrees of success. But after 2008 and the global financial crisis, I think there was a desire to find another source of investment so that they weren't overly reliant on Germany and Brussels.
Germany and Brussels, right? Yeah.
And they looked to China, and China made a lot of promises.
Yeah.
But what's now happened is China didn't deliver on the promises. So even in the economic realm, a lot of these Central and Eastern European countries are giving up. I mean, if you look at the last meeting of this, it was 17+1, because Greece is the last joiner. I would love to learn more about that story, and I hope I do get to learn about it when I'm in Greece next year, because Greece basically jumped on the bandwagon, the China bandwagon, just as everyone else is jumping off.
Right. It seems strange.
It's very strange.
We're like the British driving on the wrong side of the road. We're the only ones.
Maybe, but I'm sure there is a logic to it that is a domestic story, probably, because it doesn't make a lot of sense from the broader kind of geoeconomic perspective. Although even that, it may be a little different, because, you know, Piraeus is a very concrete investment, and the Chinese have come through with those investments. So it's very different, for example, from Chinese promises to Polish pork farmers and Slovakian agriculture, and even a lot of the infrastructure that has been roads, and then the controversy over IT infrastructure, which has only really proceeded successfully in Serbia. In the Greek case, the Piraeus thing seems to have gone pretty well. So that may be part of the explanation, but I imagine there's a bigger story behind it as well.
You know, we're looking here with a group of the students at Anatolia High School at the ways in which the media are at least covering the stories. And I'm wondering, the top message I got on my inbox right now is the Protocol Alert newsletter. And the title of the story is "What Really Brought Down LinkedIn's China Play?" And it would seem to be that there's a persistent and prevalent narrative in mainstream American media, and it doesn't matter if it's the New York Times or Wall Street Journal, that they're very, very critical of economic dealings with China. And they're bringing up the bad news, so to speak. You know, what's going wrong in all of this? Who's backing out and who's being kicked out? And I'm wondering if you're finding, as you're looking at the so-called drivers of public opinion in various member states of the European Union, that you're finding this sort of prevailing narrative also. I mean, is this what we would see if we're looking at business news from Prague? Is this what one might expect to see in the business news coming out of Athens? Is there a kind of a master narrative developing in that sense?
Yeah, I think this is a great question, because to me, the pattern kind of starts in the US, where we had a situation in the Republican Party where the party was really divided in its China attitudes.
Okay.
The sort of Main Street conservatives were anti-communist, anti-authoritarian, whether they're, libertarian Republicans or, a religious right Republicans who would be anti-communist. Basically your small town Republican conservative would be anti-China. But for
Right.
decades in the 70s, 80s, 90s, even into the 21st century, those voices were drowned out in the Republican Party because of all the business Republicans who had a lot of weight in the Republican Party. And the US-China Business Council, other business interest groups, basically steered the Republican Party to have overall a pro-China position. In sort of pitching this idea of 1 billion customers, 1 billion pairs of shoes we can sell or produce,
billion cars.
And to be honest, during the 80s and 90s, those economic interactions were positive sum, and a lot of American businesses were making a lot of money. And this is why the business Republicans were able to control the Republican Party's China policy.
Right.
But what happened about a decade ago was China started to squeeze out international businesses, make things harder and harder for international businesses to profit from their engagement with China. And so all of a sudden, the US-China Business Council became divided, and even slowly overall to have a new theme of, we're not benefiting. We're getting cheated here, basically. Okay. And then once the business Republicans were no longer unified in a pro-China position, the kind of background noise of a kind of greater skepticism among the rank and file conservatives within the Republican Party emerged. So all of this is to say that I think something similar is happening in Europe. So certainly in the UK, and I think maybe we'll see this, maybe this is the future in Greece as well, is, initially incredible optimism and hope about China as an economic partner, as a solution. You had this golden era mantra in the UK about trade with China. This was going to save Britain, be part of the economic solution. And even until recently with Brexit, Boris promised, well, don't worry, if we don't have as much trade with Europe, we can increase our trade with China. The problem is it doesn't always happen. Yeah. And when the business interests realize that, hey, maybe we're not benefiting as much as we thought we could, Chinese business practices are more mercantilistic and less truly free market than we hoped, then all of a sudden the China skeptics have an opening to be more negative about China. And you have Europeans sort of looking at China less purely in economic terms. And part of that has been a result of changing Chinese policy. So, it's not just Hong Kong, it's not just Taiwan, it's not just border conflicts with India, it's Xinjiang, it's Muslims.
It's the cumulative effect, in essence.
Yeah, and they all get at core, liberal values. Yeah. And so all of a sudden, those issues matter more. It used to be the case that the U.S. was the superpower and had the broad relationship with China. Yeah. And in Europe, it was just an economic relationship, but it's just not that way anymore. It's become a broader relationship, and that has allowed more negative voices in many ways to start to emerge. Okay. Now, that hasn't happened in Greece yet, but this is kind of a question mark. Will it?
If any of these, that would be one of the things you'd want to study and try to develop an explanatory model so that we have a sense of why the Greek case appears to be so unique at this moment in time.
Yeah, I'm excited to look at that, and in particular to look carefully at the Piraeus interactions and how they're understood, and in particular, if we start to see any problems with that relationship, because that has been the pattern in other large Chinese infrastructure investments.
Right. We haven't seen it yet, but perhaps we're just laggards in that sense, and within another 6 months, the climate may turn. It perhaps will appear also as we approach an election season, and then you suspect maybe China might become an issue in electoral politics. Pete, you've told me that you're interested also more broadly in the region of the Balkans, in the Eastern Mediterranean, and you mentioned Turkey. So without necessarily asking you to reveal what's on the cards, what would one be looking for in these broader regions if one were looking at what we call the drivers of the views of the local population?
Yeah, so I have this, again, my colleagues in the Czech Republic have funding for a broad set of surveys. And in the spring, there are going to be surveys in both Turkey and Greece. So I have agreed to work with them on both designing and analyzing those surveys. So Turkey is a great opportunity. Obviously, Turkey is extremely important. We really don't know very much about how ordinary Turks think about China. Most of what we know is at the elite level, the leadership level, and then we think, oh, well, Turkey loves China. Well, the Turkish elite may, for a variety of reasons that may have more to do with geopolitics than almost anything else. Okay. But actually, there's an instructive comparison with Hungary, because in Hungary, the leadership is extremely pro-China, and the media is fairly well captured by the governing elite. And yet, when we look closely at our public opinion survey data, while we did find that supporters in Hungary of their authoritarian leader, I always get Erdogan and Orban confused.
Orban, yeah, Orban is Hungary and Erdogan is Turkey.
That's right. So Orban, you know, he's very pro-China, and his supporters are more pro-China than people who don't like Orban. But on average, Hungarians don't like China. They do not like China. So if you just look at the elites, it's very misleading.
Yeah.
So to just assume from the fact that Erdogan has been very pro-China, that all Turks are very pro-China, I think is a mistake. And it's possible you could have a kind of Hungarian example. On the other hand, you could have,
in other words, yeah, he could be outflanked.
You could have a discontinuity between public opinion and elite China policy. Right. On the other hand, you could have continuity. So Serbia, from what we know, there are good public opinion surveys that have been done in Serbia, and the Serbian public overall is very positive towards China, not just the Serbian leadership. Now, that may be a special case because you have, you know, the wars, Serbia in Kosovo, and, you know, China was an ally of the government in Belgrade, and they shared a common anti-Americanism.
Well, China was vehemently opposed to recognizing Kosovo because you have parallels that would maybe imply that recognition of Taiwan is on the cards for the international community, and that's a non-starter if you are the PRC, are you not?
Yes, that's absolutely right. And on top of that, you have this accident of history of the Belgrade embassy bombing in 1999, where NATO planes bombed the source of radio signals. Basically, intelligence signals were coming out of the building that the Chinese embassy was in, and NATO planes bombed that building, claiming they didn't realize it was the Chinese embassy.
And claiming they had the wrong map, which is really just, you know, that stretches belief.
Certainly no Chinese will believe it. David, you're actually quite unusual as an American to be skeptical. Most Americans, I think, you know, buy the explanation that the the U.S. government proffered at that time? I mean, I don't know if we'll ever get to the bottom of that or not.
Peter, maybe because I read the Greek media a lot.
That's right.
Look, we're gonna round it out here. We're ending the end of our hour together. I want to thank you for being here. I want to remind our audience once again that you are a professor of Chinese politics at the University of Manchester, and that you're the director of the Manchester China Institute, also in Manchester, that you'll be spending a significant amount of time in Thessaloniki after the new year. Is my hope fervently that we collaborate together, but this is also an appeal to anyone who happens to be watching, if they somehow would like to combine forces or at least communicate with Pete. We put his email address and the URL of the Manchester China Institute in the chat box here of our broadcast. Predictions about U.S.-China relations, that might be the last question. It's an open-ended question, so it could be long or short and sweet. How is Joe Biden going to manage U.S. policy vis-a-vis the People's Republic of China?
That's a nice angle, and maybe will force me to be on the shorter side. You should never leave that open to an academic, as you know, because we'll just keep talking. You know, the shift from the Trump administration to the Biden administration, on the one hand, there is now a consensus on both sides of the aisle in the US, both among Republicans and Democrats, that engagement didn't really work.
Okay.
And that China's rise is becoming destabilizing to the international system. So from that perspective, we're not seeing huge changes, you know, in terms of the skepticism of the American leadership towards China, a desire to work together where possible, but a recognition of the limits of the possibilities of working together in certain areas. Now, that said, process matters. And there's a huge difference between how the Trump administration and how the Biden administration have conducted their China policy. The first and by far most important is that Biden is not Trump. And Trump, because he was a narcissist, you know, he changed his tune depending on who he was talking to. So when he was talking to Taiwanese, like the president of Taiwan, who called him when he first won in 2016, he said, "Oh yeah, we support Taiwan," which then immediately destabilized the Taiwan Strait. And then he spoke to the Chinese side and he said, "Oh, of course, we recognize Taiwan as part of China." And then, of course, Taiwanese get anxious. So, you know, this kind of volatility of Trump himself, his need for affirmation, leading him to say whatever he wants to say, to feel loved, was incredibly destabilizing factor in U.S.-China relations. So that's gone with Biden, thank God. The second aspect is that, generally speaking, Democrats are more in favor of and have more confidence in diplomacy as a means to conducting international affairs. Republicans tend to be more likely to disparage diplomacy, negotiation, and feel like you should talk with a stick. That force is a more appropriate way to conduct international affairs. And I think for that reason, things have stabilized quite a bit as well. You have an increasing routinization of a relationship with China that was kind of in limbo or unanchored for 4 years under the Trump administration.
Okay, so that hints that Biden is just Trump light are perhaps misguided.
Absolutely.
Okay. Look, we're going to close the discussion here. I thank Peter Gries once again, a sometime neighbor here in the city of Thessaloniki. Allow me just to say a few things. I'm accompanied today by a Dukakis Center a senior intern who goes by the name of Chrysi. Her name is one of these very long and complicated Greek names, so I won't try to pronounce it. But she is acting as our production assistant in the studio we've set up on the campus of ACT, the American College of Thessaloniki. We've been joined also by a colleague of our friend Pendalis Savidis, Spiros Kanouras, who's been manning the controls on the other end of the broadcast. So I want to tip my hat to both of you and thank you for being with us this hour. Thanks to all of the our friends and well-wishers who are watching us on a variety of social media formats and platforms. Our next guest in November will be a very dear friend, Afton Anastasakis, the founding director of Southeast European Studies at Oxford, director of the European Studies Center at St. Anthony's College, Oxford, and professor of international relations. He'll be joining me for a discussion on 10 years of crisis and reform in Greek and European politics, looking back to the immediate aftermath of the sovereign debt crisis in Greece and the various attempts to reform the apparatus of the Greek state and the response to the crisis in Brussels and perhaps in various European capital cities also. That will be tentatively on Friday, November 12th. It will be a companion piece to a virtual exhibition one of my interns is preparing, a collection of banners and posters that our public relations and marketing teams have created for the many events that Dukakis Center has hosted since November 2011, when we became formally an academic center. So that's a rather important pair of events that we have on the horizon. I want to say also that we're going to host our annual civil society forum in January, on January 27th. Is one of a very large number of events that are being organized around the world in collaboration with the think tanks and civil societies program at the University of Pennsylvania. We hosted their director, Jim McGann, at one of our events in Athens a few years ago. Our guest on the corresponding Dukakis Center Live program on the Anik Nefsi's web TV channel will be Beth Simone Novak, a veteran of the Obama administration, formerly of New York University, now at Northeastern University in Boston. And we'll be talking about skills and training for public sector workers, employees, and generally in civil society, both the private and public sector. So I'm quite excited about that event that we can look forward to in the toward the end of January 2022. So here I am, David Wisner, host of Dukakis Center Live. I'm professor of international relations at ACT, the American College of Thessaloniki. Thanks for being with us. Spiros will hit the credit sequence and we'll take our leave. Good night.
Adeya.
You changed the date again.
Did I? Okay.